Welcome to Money as Material Culture, Curation and Collections at America's Money Museum. I'll be talking about how numismatics can be made part of your museum, from collections care to using numismatics in your exhibits and programming. Now, numismatics is a vast science that encompasses an array of objects covering thousands of years and consisting of many materials in multiple shapes and sizes. Not all of these items are unified under the umbrella of having some economic function. Metals and decorations in particular are included partly due to 18th century conventions and also because of their similarity in shape, composition, design, and manufacture to coins, the original core medium most often associated with numismatics as an academic discipline. So I will be talking about money, its origins, the science of numismatics, and how all of this applies to museums in terms of collecting, care, curation, and exhibition. This program can only provide a very general introduction due to the time constraints, but please ask questions at the end and I will try to answer in more detail where possible. So, for most of human existence, trade with communities and small areas was handled without coins or paper money. Many types of objects have been used as money, from carved stones to the feathers of rare birds. The only requirements were that the objects be reasonably available and durable so that they could represent value. So what is money? A simple definition is that money is anything that people accept as payment in exchange for goods or services and has been used in one form or another ever since humans began to trade. The earliest forms of money were used to create a system of measure so that the value of items could be compared for exchange. Money also can be a means of storing or accumulating wealth. In some cultures, money has a purely ceremonial or prestige purpose in which the value of the object rests not in what it can buy, but what it represents. The earliest forms of trade involved barter, i.e., a farmer who needed a clay pot would trade his excess wheat with a potter. The problem came when the potter did not need wheat, or when a fair exchange could not be agreed upon. Things became more complicated when the potter needed an axe, so the farmer would need to find a blacksmith who needed wheat, and then he could trade an axe for a pot, etc. A medium of exchange simplified life by allowing things to be compared to a standard, establishing a medium which could be used to create a system of exchange rates for various commodities. Thus, a bushel of wheat might be worth 5 pots, and 5 pots might be worth 1 bronze axe, which might be worth half a cow, etc. All of this occurred in places where we find the earliest evidence of people settling down in one place to form permanent settlements for the first time. These were the ancient cradles of civilization, such as the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, Egypt along the Nile, the Indus Valley, or in China's major river valleys. The first money in many cultures were animals or commodities that could be used in multiple ways. Here we have an example of a flint blank, which could be made into a variety of tools or points for hunting or fighting. Since the origin of a particular flint sample can be identified and tracked, we have evidence of flint being traded over vast distances thousands of years ago. This, along with the fact that they are found in blank form, suggests that they are among the earliest trade commodities. Once somebody received this, they could choose to make it into a point, arrow or spear point, or perhaps a scraper or some other tool that was useful at the time. Bronze axes are also found in areas far from where they were originally made. Not only could they be a store of value, but they were useful in themselves as tools. Metal tools became the basis for some of the earliest forms of Chinese money, for example. These objects reflect a new development in social interactions, from purely local to more distant trade, which involved different commodities, raw materials or manufactured goods which did not exist in one area, being traded from areas where they did exist, ranging from raw flint to bronze and including luxury items such as lapis lazuli, gemstones, mother of pearl, and art objects. Certain objects emerged as preferred standards of value for long-distance trade. Throughout much of Eastern Asia, cowrie shells were commonly used in trade. The Chinese even produced imitation cowries carved from bone or cast in bronze for use as burial goods. This system of cowrie money stretched from China to portions of Eastern Asia Minor and East Africa, and continued in use up until the 1950s in places such as East Africa. In the Mediterranean region, Asia Minor, and parts of Africa, the system of trade was based on cattle. Cattle were a common early form of money in many cultures, with measures of wealth and property values given in terms of a given number of cows. Goods were also valued in terms of cows, a practice that eventually became obsolete as trade became more complex. For some of this was for obvious reasons. It was difficult to divide a cow without losing value, or if you moved a herd of cattle over a large distance, perhaps they would lose a considerable amount of their value from the hardships of the road. So there were advantages to using other types of objects or cattle as a form of a medium of exchange. The development of a system of weights and measures was necessary to the invention of money as we know it today. This development was a byproduct of the emergence of more complex social organizations, with taxes and more sophisticated trade, which required standardized measurement systems. And so what we mean by these standardized measurement systems was a system where an authority would create a standard for weights and measures. So a pound would be represented by a standard pound that would be in the form of a stone or a bronze weight, and would be kept by the officials in a place where it was secure and used to compare all of the other weights that were produced. They were supposed to follow that same standard, and thus you can ensure that when somebody bought a bushel of wheat or a pound of metal or something, that it would exactly match what the standard was, and that became a way of charging taxes and also creating fair trade systems. A central authority was needed to develop and monitor such systems. By 2000 BC, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and China had all developed systems of weights and measures which were enforced by the local authorities. After the development of a system of weights and measures, metals became important when merchants realized they could provide a more manageable, durable, and flexible medium of exchange, and long-distance trade largely converted in many places from cattle, cowries, and other materials to metals. Prior to the invention of coinage, metals used in trade came in all shapes and sizes, from spits of bronze or iron as used in Iron Age Greece and the Balkans, to irregular lumps of copper, bronze, gold, and silver, or electrum, onto ingots or pieces of wire in gold, silver, or copper. The advantages of metal were its easy divisibility, its durability, its high intrinsic value, and its relative compactness. The use of precious metals as money began with the ancient civilizations of the Near East and China. As early as 2000 BC in both Mesopotamia and Egypt, there emerged the practice of carefully weighing pieces of gold and silver to determine their value, in paying tribute to local rulers, placing offerings at sacred temples, and in performing business transactions. At first, metal objects were used, including spits, cauldrons, and tripods in Greece, rough bronze ingots in Italy, lightweight copies of bronze tools in China, or copper, silver, and gold rings in Egypt. These evolved into pieces valued by weight and purity. A hierarchy of value was developed for these metals as trade increased. Money in the form of small metal discs or lumps marked with information guaranteeing their value was independently invented in Asia Minor, India, and China during the first millennium BC. These objects were the first coins, i.e., they have a regular weight for each denomination, are marked for identification, and circulate at a fixed rate without the need for weighing. The coins from these three areas became the major world monetary traditions, Greek, Indian, and Chinese, which still influence our modern ideas of how money should look and how it should be used. And initially, the marks were very simple. For example, the copper banliang basically states its weight in copper or bronze. The silver karshapanas of India were very irregular but closely weighed pieces of silver that had multiple stamps on them, which we don't fully understand today. We believe that those stamps represent the different merchants that handled them, and so they received a guarantee of their purity and their weight by being stamped by the users. So an interesting concept that didn't last beyond a couple hundred years. And then this Electrum Hecti is simply a lump of electrum, which is an alloy of gold and silver that was used in Asia Minor from a very early date, almost certainly produced by a merchant, with the marks possibly identifying the piece so that when the merchant encountered these, he knew that it was something that he had already handled and had a certain weight standard to it. The kings of Lydia soon adopted the idea of coinage, beginning the tradition of state-issued coinage that has continued to this day. With the invention of coinage came one of the most historically important uses of money. Money as a means of communication through its designs and legends, which was elaborated by the Greeks in their quest to celebrate the invention of their new city-state political organizations. A nation's money is often the first impression a visitor gets of the nature of a country. As such, the designs and legends placed on money have been considered important by the authorities responsible for their issue, making money critically important to the study of history. This is especially true before the age of the printing press, when options for disseminating information were limited, labor-intensive, and expensive. At the time when coins were invented, there wasn't even any paper that was produced in large quantities, so you essentially had stone inscriptions, inscriptions on clay, which were not very portable or usable in the long run unless they were baked and then they were fixed, or word of mouth. So this was really one of the very early forms of mass media, a mass communication tool that was unprecedented for the time. From simple tools of trade and markers of value, money is developed through the invention of coinage into declarations of independence and power to more subtle messages conveying complex political concepts. Modern coins and paper money reflect the legacy left by the ancient world in a rich numismatic pageant with messages whose implications are still relevant today. Now, talking about storage, storing numismatic objects provides its own unique challenges, especially for coins, metals, and tokens, mostly due to their size and the numbers needed for a representative collection. So a collection such as the A&H collection encompasses approximately 275,000 objects, which range from paper money to coins, metals, and then the related objects, including a few money banks and weights and measures, scales, that kind of thing. But coins are by far the largest part of this collection and incorporate something like about, say, 120,000 of the objects are coins. This takes a considerable amount of space, but relative to other types of collections, it's minuscule. So we have a number of cases, such as the one you see in the background here, which have drawers in them, and these drawers are set up so that they hold the standard envelopes or flips, as we call them, which each contain a single coin and also have the label information on the back, or in the case of the plastic flips, in a sleeve. There's two pockets, and so one pocket will have the coin and the other pocket will have a sleeve which contains the label information, the accession number, the weight, etc. So this is how you typically see coins stored. As well, we use felt trays to hold the underneath the coins. Whenever we're viewing coins, we typically do them over a table, and then we have a felt pad on the table just in case you drop the coins to minimize damage. Now here We have some different storage methods. Now, this storage method is typically used for metals and decorations, and in some places for the coins themselves. Smithsonian Institution, the American Numismatic Society, and others use storage cabinets such as this, in which the coins could all be laid out. And from a curatorial standpoint, this is an excellent way to do it because it makes it much easier to quickly identify what coins might be used for an exhibit or need to be studied, that kind of thing, because they're all visible as opposed to having to take them out of individual holders. Paper money has its own needs and concerns for storage. The most common standard is to use non-PVC mylar holders open on two sides to allow the paper to breathe, to hold individual notes along with acid-free cardboard boxes in which to store the multiples of notes in drawers such as the one depicted here. Now these sleeves add a bit of protection, but they also make it possible to see the notes and make it easier to work with them without actually having to take them out of the holder. Now our notes will typically have a label in the upper right-hand corner, which will include the basic information of where it was issued, when it was issued, and the serial number in order to replace the note, and also the accession number. When it comes to traditional money and other larger objects that are part of the numismatic collections, these are stored in much the same way as similar objects would be in an anthropological collection. So we use acid-free papers, acid-free cardboard boxes, and then drawers of various sizes in order to store these. Here are some numismatic conservation tips. These are very basic, but they're a start, and they give you an idea of the kinds of things that you want to use when you're storing, particularly the metals, but also the papers. Basically, this comes down to using acid-free and sulfur-free products to store and handle the objects, and due to their small size, using felt pads or similar soft surfaces under coins or metals as they are being handled in order to avoid damage should they be dropped. For similar reasons, numismatic storage areas should be carpeted where possible, preferably in a neutral color so that the coins can be distinguished from the carpet. The worst is to have a coin drop on a carpet with a tight pattern that's close to the color of the coin. It can often be very difficult to find your coin after that. Numismatics has been recognized as an important auxiliary to history and archaeology since at least the 18th century. Numismatic collections have certain unique characteristics. A, they require little storage space. B, they are popularly collected and studied as an insular field unto themselves. In the United States, this has resulted in relative isolation from numismatic knowledge from historical, archaeological, and economic studies in academia, which is a problem, and one of the things that I've worked during my career to try to bridge this gap really is not helpful to any of the studies involved. So wherever possible, I try to use history to approach numismatic knowledge, or I try to use numismatic knowledge to inform archaeological or economic studies. There's a specialized set of practices associated with numismatics. Storage and conservation, as we've touched on, die studies that can identify date sequences within sets of the same coins. Basically, coins are struck with dies, and these dies leave characteristic marks that allow them to be identified from coin to coin in which they were used. Well, these dies deteriorated at a different rate. The obverse die, the upper die, deteriorates at a slower rate at a faster rate than the lower die, which means you can create die sequences which allow you to date a series of coins within that issue. And for display purposes, museums like to have at least 2 examples of each type in order to display both sides simultaneously. When you combine this with the usefulness of die studies for older coins, coins that are older than any existing records that identify when and exactly how they were produced during what time, it becomes useful to have more than just one example of any given coin. You want at least two, and in some cases for ancient coins or for medieval coins, you might want dozens of them so that they become a repository of information for researchers when somebody wants to look at these coins in detail. They can find information that may not exist anywhere else. The American Numismatics Association is fortunate to have a major numismatic library consisting of well over 75,000 books, scholarly journals, and auction catalogs dating back to the 19th century. So we are a great resource, and you can find us online at the money.org website, where we have our library catalog listings and other information about the holdings and how to get information about the library and its holdings. Now, catalogs in numismatics are important because they provide references that are numbered for identifying objects. Thus, for American paper money, if one sees a reference for Friedberg number 1969-H, you will know that the note is listed in Arthur and Ira Friedberg's Paper Money of the United States, and that it is a $5 Federal Reserve note, series of 1869, issued by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis with the signatures of Dorothy Andrews Elston, Treasurer of the United States, and David M. Kennedy, Secretary of the Treasury at the time. For some categories of objects, like these, citations can replace most database object description fields, with the exception of dates, mint marks, and weights for coins and other specialized fields. This allows the knowledgeable data entry person to create records that can use a shorthand which is readable and understandable by experts. This is not always necessary and may not always be desirable, because if you have large numbers of non-experts looking at these, the reference is still necessary, but you probably need to write out the other data so that the casual visitor or researcher will know in a language they understand, i.e. the $5 Federal Reserve note, series of 1969 and all that stuff, will have access to this information. The pitfalls of some of this standard reference information is that sometimes the references become obsolete, so it makes it necessary to update reference citations or maintain old reference works in your library. Some standard references do not retain the same numbering system from edition to edition. This is relatively unusual, but unfortunately, some of the major catalogs, Krause's Essential Standard Catalog of World Paper Money, for example, occasionally introduces new entries into their catalogs, and instead of continuing the numbers, will change the numbering system to reflect where those notes should be, which causes confusion. So when we use a catalog such as the Krause, we'll put the date of the edition so that anybody using that reference can go to the same edition and be sure that the reference is the correct one for that object. The answers to these questions provide an understanding for how money was used at any given period of time. Knowing who was responsible for issuing money gives insights into why the designs and inscriptions were chosen, what they were intended to say, and who their audience was. An example is the issuing authority a government or a private entity? Is the money intended for purely economic use, for internal use, or for international trade? Is it issued to meet the needs of an emergency, or is it a regular part of currency? Did it have a political or social context? Is the money issued to isolate or insulate the national economy? The Soviet currency, for example, was issued to specifically not be used on the international exchange market. They wanted a stable currency that they could completely control within the country itself. Similar reasons were used for Ptolemaic Egypt, where the rulers wanted to prevent the export of their coinage. So their coinage was good silver, but it was lighter than that used by the nations all around. This created an advantage economically because everyone that came into the country was required to exchange their coinage for Ptolemaic coinage at the same rate. So there was an automatic profit made by the government by forcing this exchange, and this benefited the rulers of the country. Another question is the money used to mark important political events? Does it serve as an international currency, or is it strictly local? Important political events could include a change in ruler, a coronation, anniversaries, victories, etc. A major role of money is to announce the independent existence of a nation. The ability of a nation to issue money is seen as a critical factor in its sovereignty. So money has become the calling card for independence. And this despite the knowledge that this money might be worthless or possibly devaluate very quickly after the first independence of the country. But that message that the country is independent and is able to issue money is extremely important and worth the problems that might occur. Now, money incorporates messages in its legends and in its imagery. Unlocking symbolic language is the key to interpreting money. Examples include, for example, dictatorial governments tend to feature images of the current leader. Democratic nations may feature images of liberty or prosperity or past heroes. Many developing nations choose to focus on images of economic progress. Money is often used to commemorate the history, hopes, aspirations, and achievements of the issuing nations or rulers, and thus becomes a very good indicator of what to expect when you actually visit a country as far as the political or economic climate. Now, the information that's on this slide, which talks about the parts of paper money, combined with the denomination vignette of President James Garfield, provides a wealth of information to the historian across a range of topics. For example, the vignette was placed on the standards design for $5 national banknotes, which this is one of, to honor Garfield shortly after his assassination in 1881. And this design was not used for a long period after this. So this is specifically a commemorative type of issue. And that information, when combined with technical issues such as the serial number, the bank serial number, and other elements, the signatures, can give you a lot of information about who was running the National Bank of Ketchum at the time, how many notes may have been issued, and other things of that sort, which, when combined with other types of knowledge, can make for a more complete picture of the history of that town at the time. Now here we have a slide with the parts of a coin. Now all of these parts have been named by numismatists in order to identify them more clearly, so that in the shorthand language that they use when they're describing coins, it becomes much easier to write shorter descriptions. So you can talk about the legend and say, legend, United States of America, $quarter with liberty in the left field, and the motto, in God we trust, in the right field, the mint mark in the right field below the head of George Washington and the motto, etc. So this nomenclature provides a shorthand in which to identify coins and metals. Now here's an example of a particular ornate coin, which has a very rich language of symbols on it, and This language of symbols, when you can interpret it, will add a lot to the knowledge of what this coin stands for, who issued it, what they wanted to say about themselves or about their country. So this, as you can see on this famous British numismatic masterpiece, the Petition Crown of 1663, it was a pattern coin of Charles II, and it was produced by Thomas Simon in order to petition Charles to accept this design for his new coinage. Unfortunately, it was unsuccessful for political reasons, but this is a masterpiece of numismatic design that incorporates a huge number of elements in not only a beautiful design, but a very complex and very meaningful design. So, as you can see on the slide, it gives you the examples of different parts. You've got the shields with the different parts of the United Kingdom at the time. You have the badge of the Most Noble Order of the Garter, which is a symbol of royal power. It was an order that was of very limited size, and the king was the person who elected people to become members of the order based on their support, on their services to the crown, etc. In the end, the overall message here is to show the greatness of King Charles and his titles and honors, which again becomes part of his story that he's trying to tell, which is he's a great ruler and rules a very important empire. Now, here we have the challenges of diversity. Traditionally, the solution to this problem for museums is to focus on different categories of objects derived from diverse cultural, social, or economic contexts. The difficulty with this approach is the challenge of integrating all of the different types of objects and gathering the often specialized expertise required to interpret these objects within the context of an overall exhibit. Numismatic objects can provide a key to solve these problems. Numismatic objects can be displayed in a small space and are primary historical documents which can be used to illustrate many storylines. So not only are these the actual objects from the time, the information they incorporate, aside from their existence and their fabric, also can serve to increase our knowledge and make more interesting stories to use in our exhibits. So from history to economics, politics, culture, or art, coins have something to say, particularly when you combine them in more modern periods with metals and paper money. The challenge for many museums is understanding how to use money in their exhibits. From conceptualization to physical display, there is so much more that can be done beyond the simple use of money as props. For example, an exhibit that I saw about 20 years ago where a payphone with change current at the time it was used as a display. The point of the display was to show it was a payphone and that it used change, but there was so much more they could have done with it in using that change and describing what it was and when it had been issued, how it was affected by the use of payphones and other machinery at the time, which was starting to use automatic payments, i.e. somebody would put a coin in a slot, and this affected the change itself and also the machines that use them, because they had to have slots of the right size. They had to have some system for identifying that the change was correct. There's a whole technology behind that affected the fabric and production of the coins themselves. Now, in order to understand how to use coins, you need to know what it is you have, how it relates to the other objects in your collections, and your mission. I mean, that's a basic thing, but where to get more information or objects, and how to effectively display numismatic objects to support your exhibits, whatever the story is. So, an example would be a railroad museum. Obsolete notes from the period from 1796 to 1866 in the United States feature a whole series of images of railroads and the various engines that pulled them. It's excellent from the standpoint of showing the development of technology. You could have a series of notes which show the earliest railroad trains with the very most primitive engines on them, to the later ones from the 1850s, which are much more advanced steam engines that are much more powerful, larger. And interestingly, aside from technology, it can also show you what's going on in the United States at the time by the scenery and the railroad tracks, where they go, where they're depicted themselves. So you get an idea of the development of the country. So at first you'll see the railroads in the context of going within cities in semi-rural settings. Later, the trains will be used in rural settings, going across great empty spaces, for example, the Great Plains. And many of these scenes will show Native Americans in the background hunting buffalo and all these things. And often these images were used as a way to juxtapose the advance of technology and the falling behind of the native peoples as they're being overwhelmed by technology and population pressures and pushed further west and off into the margins. So notes of these kinds can really give an added dimension to other types of displays because of what they show on them, what they represent, and the stories that can be derived from the images that are on them. Now, so money has stories to tell, and from these stories of individual objects to groups, told by their images and legends or by the circumstances and reasons for which they were issued. The ANA is a primary resource for information about money with its collections and extensive library. So we often work with people to help develop their stories, whether stories for our magazine or stories to be used in their own displays at coin conventions, things like that, or for developing larger exhibits. On this slide, we talk about the evolution of an exhibit. This is an exhibit that we had on display about 14, 15 years ago, and it was designed to display what was going on in the world today through current money. And by current money, we were using notes and coins issued since the year 2000. Since money is the calling card of nations, it can be used to understand the values and principles which the nations wish to be known for, aspire to, or believe that they stand for. Here we have the entryway of the money of the world today, showing the globe with its text rail and part of the Australia and Oceania portion of the exhibit. How to organize the exhibit was a major question. It was decided to go with an organizing principle that everyone is already familiar with, a geographic division of the world into continents. Other possibilities could have been political organization, i.e. democracies, dictatorships, monarchies, all grouped together, economic philosophies, capitalism versus communism, perhaps religion, language, political alignments, i.e. memberships in international organizations. All of these present special problems in interpretation and, in some cases, special advantages as well. Now, getting money from each country was more difficult than I would have thought when I started to work on this. It's not an easy problem, and it's in part because there's not a large collecting market for current money, i.e. nobody is particularly interested in collecting a coin from the United States that was struck in 2015. Mostly people are interested in collecting older coins, whether they be 20 or 30 years old or 300 years old. So most dealers do not stock it. So it makes it hard to get these coins. Now, those that do specialize in the easier to obtain and less expensive pieces generally will have a selection of them, but they're not going to have a complete set, particularly of those coins that come from nations with less desirable pieces. Maybe they're not as pretty, maybe they're not as exciting looking. There are a lot of reasons. Now, some of the problems also pertain to the economic systems. Now, some countries may not issue money at all. For example, Ecuador, which no longer issues its own coinage because they found it simpler and cheaper to use US dollar coins, which are not popular in the US, so they can get a good deal from the US Treasury in purchasing these coins and circulating them as their own. This prevents problems with inflation, devaluation, all this kind of things, which they were experiencing when they were issuing their own money. So while it takes away their ability to celebrate their sovereignty in their money, it does create for a more stable economic system, which was more important to them at that time. Other problems include nations with closed economies. They place restrictions on the export of their currency, and that can make it very difficult to get examples of their money for use in an exhibit like this. So these are just a few of the problems that we encountered while we were trying to gather the objects that we needed to use in the exhibit. Normally, we would use our collector base to borrow the rare, more unusual coins. But since these were all modern, recent coins, there are very few people that were collecting them. So we had to go out onto the market to find these things and either get dealers or travelers to pick up the coins and donate them to us, or in a couple of cases, to purchase them. Determining what information to highlight was also an important aspect here. Statistics were gathered for each country along with the national flag, a selection of images, and 2 examples of each of 2 banknotes and 2 coins for each country. The information was presented in a standardized format to make comparison between countries easier. The statistics were chosen to allow visitors to compare nations and regions and to draw parallels between different types of governments, economies, and relative wealth in conjunction with the images and messages presented on the money itself to get an overall view of what is going on in the world today. Here's an example of our introductory panels. This is for the continent of Europe. Each continent was formed in its own area. So the exhibit cases circled these introductory panels. So the typical continent would have 6 to 10 cases to accommodate all of the nations that were involved. And they would be arranged around the central panel. And then there would be things around them, such as our passport stands, which you can see in the next slide. And the introductory panels were focused on giving basic geographic features of each continent and to give an overview of their monetary history and current information, such as the number of countries and overall population. The African continent entryway showed the passport station as well as examples of African artifacts. Organizing the exhibit by continents provides a familiar framework for visitors on which they can build to understand the information presented in the exhibit. Each nation had a write-up combined with the other 2 or 3 nations that were in the same case that included stats for the capital city, name of their base currency unit, population, life expectancy, date of UN admission, size, and languages spoken. Label cards include information on exchange rates versus the dollar and other types of information that was current as of the time of the exhibit, which was the third quarter of 2005. And then each case included a back panel with country information and typical images, the objects, including objects selected for regional flavor, and a label card, including labels for each object, as well as information on the currencies of each country in the case. And then we had our passports, which were passed out to mainly the younger visitors, but was available to anybody who wished to get one. And they encouraged people to ask questions and get answers for some questions that were provided from the exhibit. Plus, as you went through the exhibit, you could use the stamping areas within each continent to create a stamp to fill your passport for each continent. And here you see an example of the stamp on the European page. And with that, we come to the end of our presentation today. And here we have some contact information. And please feel free to contact us or me if you have further questions. We will also answer questions as soon as I finish here